Tonight, imagine yourself stepping into a frontier cabin, swallowed by snowdrifts so high they press against the walls like a second landscape. The roof bowed under frozen weight, the wind crying across empty plains with a sound that feels almost alive. And before we go any further, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. If this kind of slow, immersive history helps you rest, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now, because tonight we are going back to a world where sleep itself was an act of survival. You push the heavy wooden door closed behind you and feel the cold rush in one last time, sharp enough to steal your breath before the cabin seals itself again into a dim, smoky stillness. And as your eyes adjust, you realize how fragile this shelter truly is. A single room of rough logs, chinked with mud and moss, no insulation, no glass windows, only thin shutters and hope standing between a family and a night that could quite literally freeze them to death. Because for frontier families, winter wasn't uncomfortable, it was dangerous, and every night was a quiet calculation of warmth, endurance, and luck. Inside, the smell of pine smoke clings to everything. The walls, the clothes, the blankets, the air itself, and shadows stretch and sway as the embers in the hearth pulse faintly like a tired heartbeat. And you become aware that there is no hum of heat, no steady furnace, only a fire that must be coaxed and guarded through the night, because if it dies, the cold will not wait politely until morning. It will creep in silently, stiffening fingers, freezing water pails, turning breath into frost inside the room. Frontier families slept, knowing this, knowing that comfort was not the goal, survival was. And historians still argue whether anyone truly slept deeply on such nights, or whether rest came in fragments, half dreams broken by shivers and the soft scrape of someone rising to stir the coals, because cabins were leaky things, built quickly from necessity, logs stacked and sealed with whatever could be found, clay, moss, even animal hair, anything to slow the wind that cut like knives through the cracks. If you look to the corner of the room, you see where the family sleeps. Not beds as we imagine them now, but straw pallets laid over packed earth, sacks stuffed with dried grasses or corn husks that rustle softly when someone shifts. And though they are uneven and scratchy, they are precious, because lying directly on frozen ground could drain warmth from the body faster than the fire could replace it. So families layered everything they owned between themselves and the earth: straw, quilts, hides, old clothing sewn together into thick patchwork blankets, heavy enough to pin sleepers down. They slept close, pressed shoulder to shoulder, children tucked between parents, not out of affection alone, but because bodies were heat, and heat was life, and a single quilt stretched over many people trapped warmth, better than several spread thin. So the cabin at night became a knot of breathing, shifting figures, the sound of coughs, whispered words, the soft creak of wood under too much weight, and sometimes the faint rustle of mice moving beneath the straw, unwelcome but tolerated in a world where even pests were preferable to freezing. Near the walls the cold was strongest, and so families learned small, almost desperate tricks to keep it out, plastering the logs with mud mixed with straw or even cow dung to seal the cracks, an earthy, acrid smell lingering in the room, but blocking drafts just enough to matter. And some settlers went further, stuffing rags soaked in bacon grease into gaps between logs, the fat hardening in the cold and forming a crude but surprisingly effective barrier. And though bears may have enjoyed the scent outside, inside it meant fewer icy fingers reaching into the dark. The fire itself was both savior and threat, and as you imagine lying near it, cheek turned toward the warmth radiating from the stones, you also understand the danger, because sparks could leap, smoke could thicken, and entire cabins were lost in minutes when flames caught straw or quilts. So families slept with one ear tuned to the crackle of embers, grateful for the heat but wary of it, knowing that warmth and destruction came from the same source. Outside, the frontier night was loud in its silence, wind scraping snow against the walls, wolves calling faintly in the distance, sounds carried far across frozen land, while inside, adults whispered lullabies to children, voices thin with exhaustion and cold, songs carried from older worlds, meant to soothe fear as much as encourage sleep. And sometimes stories were told in low voices, tales meant to distract young minds from the sting of frost forming on shutter edges and the ache of breathing cold air. And if you step back outside for a moment in your imagination, the snow crunches hard beneath your boots, the stars overhead scatter like frozen sparks, and the air slices into your lungs so sharply it hurts. And in that moment you understand just how thin the line is between life and death here, how brief exposure can drain warmth so quickly that returning to the cabin feels like stepping back into a miracle. Frontier families repeated this rhythm every night, banking the fire, piling bedding, sealing cracks, listening for the quiet that meant embers were fading, and dragging themselves up to stir the hearth again, because sleep was never passive. It was guarded, negotiated, earned in small increments of warmth, stolen back from the cold. And before we go any further into how they truly managed to endure night after night like this, how the very walls beneath their hands determined whether they woke to another dawn, let yourself sink deeper into the shadows of this cabin, the fire glowing low, the quilts heavy, the wind pressing close, because the first and most critical challenge frontier families faced began long before bedtime, with the way they built the shelter around them. Imagine standing in a clearing at the edge of the wilderness, your breath hanging in the air like smoke, the sound of wind moving through bare branches above you, and all you have to work with is an axe, your hands, and the knowledge that winter is coming whether you are ready or not. Because log cabins were not romantic symbols at first. They were emergency structures, raised quickly with whatever help neighbors could spare. Logs felled and dragged into place before snow sealed the ground solid. The logs themselves were thick and uneven, stacked one atop another, and while they looked solid from a distance, the truth revealed itself at night, when the wind found every gap, every seam, every imperfect joint, turning the inside of the cabin into a slow-moving current of cold air. So settlers learned quickly that the spaces between logs mattered as much as the logs themselves, and they filled those cracks with moss, clay, mud, ashes, animal hair, even bits of cloth, a process called chinking, crude but essential, because without it, the cabin became little more than a wooden wind tunnel. Some families experimented endlessly, pressing fresh material into the walls by candlelight, running their hands along the logs to feel for cold leaks, knowing that even a finger-wide opening could drain warmth from the entire room overnight. And in journals you find small details that feel almost desperate. Accounts of settlers mixing cow dung with clay to make a thicker seal. The smell unpleasant, but the result undeniable. Fewer drafts, warmer nights, children sleeping a little longer before shivering woke them. The roof above them was another gamble entirely, often made from hand-split shingles or rough boards weighted down with stones when nails were scarce, and as snow accumulated, families lay awake listening to the slow groan of timber under the weight, praying the sound remained steady and did not crack, because collapse in the middle of the night could mean exposure, injury, or worse, and more than one diary records mornings when snow had fallen directly onto bedding through gaps in the roof, dusting sleepers like powdered sugar. Floors offered no comfort either, because most early cabins had none at all, only packed earth tamped down hard with water and labor, until it felt almost like stone, and while this surface held up to daily use, at night it became a massive heat sink, pulling warmth from bodies above it. So families layered straw, dried leaves, rushes, anything that could trap air and slow the cold creeping upward, replacing it regularly as it broke down into dust underfoot. You can almost hear the soft crunch of straw beneath blankets as someone shifts in their sleep. Feel how even small movements send faint ripples through the bedding, and imagine the strange mixture of smells that lingered in the room: earth, smoke, dry grass, wool, all blending into a scent that frontier children would later remember as the smell of home, even though it meant cold, hunger, and endurance. Over time, if a family survived long enough, improvements came slowly. Split logs laid flat to form puncheon floors, raised slightly above the ground, boards added where tools allowed, and eventually rugs or hides laid over them. But in the early years, every night was spent inches from frozen soil, and the knowledge that a single mistake, a missed crack in the wall, a weak spot in the floor, could steal warmth silently while everyone slept. What historians still debate is not whether these cabins were cold, because they unquestionably were, but whether they were just warm enough. And many accounts suggest they hovered at the edge of survivability, not comfortable, not safe by modern standards, but barely adequate. And adequacy was enough when paired with vigilance, habit, and shared warmth. Families developed rituals around inspection, running hands along walls before bed, pressing fresh moss into suspicious seams, hanging extra cloth where the wind whistled loudest. And children learned early that bedtime wasn't only about sleep, it was about preparation, about turning a fragile structure into a temporary shield against a night that did not forgive mistakes. And even once the walls were sealed, the floor layered and the roof held firm under snow, the cold did not disappear. It lingered, waiting, pressing in from every surface, reminding everyone inside that the cabin was not a refuge from winter, only a negotiation with it, a fragile pause in the cold's advance. So as you settle deeper into this imagined space, the logs close around you, the straw beneath you rustling softly, the fire glowing low, understand that sleep here was never passive. It rested on the strength of walls built by tired hands, on gaps sealed with whatever could be found, and on the quiet knowledge that the cabin itself was the first line of defense against a night that could undo everything by morning. Long after the family has finally settled beneath the weight of quilts and hides, after whispers have faded and breathing has slowed, the cabin does not truly fall asleep, because at its center the fire remains awake, glowing faintly, demanding attention even in the deepest hours of the night. You lie still, aware of how the warmth ebbs and flows, how the air closest to your face cools first, how your fingers instinctively curl inward as the heat pulls back, and in this half-dreaming state you begin to understand that on the frontier cold did not arrive suddenly, it crept in patiently, testing whether the fire had been tended well enough to last until dawn. The hearth rests low and dark, stones blackened by years of smoke and use, embers buried carefully beneath ash so they might breathe slowly through the night, and families learned through trial and exhaustion how delicate this balance was, how too much ash could smother the fire entirely, and too little could let it burn itself out long before morning. Someone almost always rose before the cold became unbearable, slipping from beneath quilts with a quiet wince, bare feet recoiling against the frozen floor, hands moving by memory alone as they knelt to stir the coals, coaxing a brief flare of orange back into the darkness, sparks leaping softly before settling again into a steadier glow. This act became so familiar that many settlers later wrote they could tend a fire without fully waking, their bodies responding before their minds did, guided by the simple knowledge that if the hearth went silent, sleep itself would become dangerous. Children learned the language of fire early, not through words but through sound. The gentle crackle that meant warmth still held, the hollow stillness that meant trouble, and even in dreams their ears remained trained to listen, because silence in a winter cabin was never peaceful, it was a warning. Smoke lingered constantly, curling along the ceiling and clinging to hair and blankets, stinging eyes and throats, yet it was tolerated without complaint, because a smoky room could be endured, while a cold one could not. And so families accepted the trade without hesitation, breathing shallowly, coughing softly, grateful for the heat even as it burned their lungs. To stretch that warmth further, they turned the fire into something portable, heating stones or bricks in the coals, wrapping them in cloth, and sliding them beneath quilts. The heat at first sharp and almost painful before settling into a deep, comforting glow that eased stiff joints and numbed toes, buying a few more hours of safer sleep. Some families carried baked potatoes to bed wrapped in rags, children clutching them like small animals, warming hands and bellies before exhaustion pulled them under, and by morning those same potatoes lay cold and shriveled, yet still eaten without complaint, because nothing was wasted when winter ruled the night. Every one of these choices carried risk. A spark too close to straw, a cloth too thin around a heated stone, but frontier families understood that survival itself was a series of calculated dangers, and warmth, however imperfect, was worth the gamble. As the fire settled again, the cabin grew quiet in a particular way, wood popping softly, wind muted by snow, pressed against the walls, breathing deepening across the room, and you can imagine lying there, half aware, feeling heat on one side of your face while cold lingered on the other, knowing that sleep would come not because conditions were comfortable, but because the body eventually surrendered to exhaustion. And in that surrender, the fire remained the true guardian of the night. Its faint glow watched even through closed eyes, carrying the family forward, hour by fragile hour, toward a morning that was never promised, only hoped for. The night deepens, and with it, the cabin seems to shrink inward, every sound softened by snow piled high against the walls. And yet warmth does not come only from fire or stone, because frontier families learned that bodies themselves were tools against the cold, and so sleep became a shared endeavor, an act of closeness shaped less by affection than by necessity. You feel the press of others beneath the quilts, shoulders touching, knees tucked in close, breath warming the small pocket of air trapped between heavy layers of fabric, and this closeness is deliberate, because one body alone loses heat too quickly, while many together create something like a living hearth, a slow, steady warmth that builds through the night. Children are placed carefully, smallest bodies tucked between adults where heat gathers best, older siblings pressed along the edges to block drafts, and even the arrangement of limbs becomes purposeful, heads alternating with feet in awkward patterns that conserve space and warmth, strange to imagine now but practical when every inch of quilt mattered. Quilts themselves are heavy, stitched from scraps of worn clothing, flour sacks, old dresses, work shirts faded by sun and labor, every square carrying a fragment of daily life. And when they are pulled high, tucked carefully along the floor to block creeping air, they feel less like bedding and more like armor, pressing down with a weight that is oddly reassuring. The air beneath them grows thick and warm, filled with a mingled sense of wool, smoke, breath, and damp cloth that never quite dries in winter. And though modern minds might recoil, frontier families accepted these smells as proof that heat was being held, that the cold had been slowed, if only for a few hours. Somewhere near your feet, a dog shifts and sighs, curling tighter against the quilts, its fur radiating warmth through the thin layers, and cats creep in silently, settling wherever heat pulls, purring softly like small engines, and on the harshest nights even livestock might be brought close, a goat or calf penned near the door, its steady breathing and body heat, adding to the fragile balance inside the cabin. This sharing of space blurs boundaries between human and animal, but on the frontier such boundaries mattered little when survival was at stake, and many adults later recalled these nights with surprising fondness, remembering the comfort of warm fur against frozen toes more vividly than the discomfort or smell. Or sleep comes unevenly, broken by coughs, by the rustle of straw, by the quiet movement of someone pulling the quilt tighter along the floor, and yet exhaustion smooths the edges of discomfort, drawing minds into shallow dreams shaped by firelight and wind, dreams where warmth and danger intertwine. Outside, the storm may rage or the night may lie still and bitter, but inside the cabin the world contracts to breath and heat and the shared weight of quilts, and even fear softens in this closeness, because no one is alone, not in the dark, not against the cold. And as hours pass, bodies shift instinctively, seeking warmer spots, trading places near the center of the quilt. Small negotiations carried out half asleep, because even rest requires awareness here, a quiet cooperation learned over many nights. You lie there, feeling the steady rise and fall of breathing around you, the faint crackle of embers still alive in the hearth, the hush of snow pressing close outside, and you understand that frontier families did not sleep through winter nights so much as endure them together, weaving warmth from bodies, fabric, animals, and habit, holding the cold at bay not with comfort but with closeness, patience, and the simple refusal to let go until morning comes. As the hours slide closer to morning, another layer of quiet ingenuity reveals itself, because even with shared warmth and heavy quilts, the frontier cold had a way of finding the smallest openings, and families learned to fight it with fabric, turning beds into enclosed shelters within the shelter, small rooms inside the room where precious heat could be trapped and held. You imagine the moment before sleep, when someone rises once more to hang thick blankets or worn rugs from pegs above the bed, letting them fall like curtains along the sides, transforming an open pallet into a soft-walled cocoon, and as the fabric settles, the air inside immediately feels different, stiller, warmer, almost private, as if the vast cold world beyond has been pushed just a little farther away. These makeshift canopies are patched and uneven, sewn from old sacks, faded shirts, or lengths of cloth saved for no other purpose. And though they look humble by daylight, at night they become powerful tools, blocking drafts that creep low along the floor and sealing in the warmth created by breath and bodies, a technique so effective that travelers often remarked how much warmer a curtained bed felt than the open air of the cabin itself. Inside this fabric enclosure, sounds soften, the crackle of the fire dulls to a murmur, the wind becomes a distant presence rather than a constant threat, and breathing grows slower as warmth collects, forming a pocket of safety that allows sleep to deepen just a little more than before. Children are especially fond of these spaces, whispering quietly, tracing the weave of cloth with sleepy fingers, imagining the curtains as the walls of a secret room or a small tent. And this illusion of separation offers comfort beyond physical warmth, because it gives young minds a sense of control over a world that otherwise feels harsh and overwhelming. The air inside the canopy carries its own scent: damp wool, smoke, soap, the faint mustiness of fabric dried too slowly near the hearth, and though it grows heavy with breath, it feels protective, a trade frontier families accept without hesitation, because warmth matters more than freshness when frost waits just inches beyond the cloth. Some families decorate these hangings with simple stitches or charms, not for beauty but for reassurance, believing that symbols sewn into the corners could guard sleepers through the night. And whether these marks truly held power or simply calmed anxious minds hardly mattered, because belief itself carried warmth. When morning approaches, these fabric walls tell their own story, stiffened slightly with frost where breath has condensed, edges cold to the touch, proof of how much heat they have trapped and held, and peeling them back feels like opening a door into winter all over again. You can imagine the reluctance, the slow moment before stepping out, the shiver that follows as the warmer pocket collapses, and the understanding that this simple curtain, hung and lowered each night, has quietly protected the family while they slept. And as you settle deeper into this imagined bed, wrapped in layers of cloth and shared breath, the fabric walls around you whisper softly with each movement, holding warmth close, buying the body a little more rest, and carrying you gently through the cold hours toward the pale light of dawn that waits beyond the shutters. The fabric walls fall quiet again, and beneath them another careful habit continues through the night, because even when warmth is finally held close, frontier families rarely slept as we do now, untouched until morning, but instead drifted in and out of rest, waking gently to tend needs that could not be ignored, especially the slow stiffening of hands and feet as the cold crept back in. You feel it first in your toes, a dull ache spreading upward, and without fully waking you draw them closer to the warmest part of the bed, rubbing them together beneath the quilt. And this simple motion echoes what countless settlers did night after night, small movements meant to keep blood flowing, sensation alive, frostbite at bay. Parents learn to recognize the signs in children even in the dark, a restless shifting, a soft whimper, fingers that felt too cold to the touch, and they responded quietly, pulling quilts higher, tucking edges more tightly along the floor, guiding small hands back toward warmer bodies, because the night was no time for panic, only gentle correction. Some families placed warm objects beneath the bedding again in the deepest hours, stones reheated briefly at the hearth, or iron tools warmed and wrapped in cloth, slipped back under quilts with care, the heat faint but welcome, spreading slowly into chilled limbs, and though the warmth never lasted long, it often lasted long enough to let sleep return. Clothing played its part here as well, because many slept fully dressed, wool shirts, thick stockings, knit caps pulled low over ears, garments stiff with use, and rarely washed in winter, but chosen carefully for their ability to trap heat close to the skin, and children often fell asleep still wearing mittens, only to wake and find them somewhere beneath the bedding, cold and useless but proof they had tried. The night air inside the cabin grows thick with breath, moisture gathering invisibly on walls and fabric, and while some historians argue this dampness made nights more dangerous, others point out that settlers adapted, drying bedding near the fire by day, accepting a cycle of damp and dry as inevitable, because avoiding moisture entirely was impossible in a sealed, heated room surrounded by snow. Animals stir as well, dogs stretching, shifting closer to warmth, cats changing positions with quiet precision, and their movements often wake sleepers just enough to adjust quilts or shift bodies, a shared choreography that unfolds without words, learned over many long winters. Outside, the cold presses harder in the hours before dawn, temperatures dropping to their lowest point, and this is when the cabin's defenses are tested most severely, when fires burn lowest, stones cool, breath frosts thickest on fabric, and the will to sleep must fight against the instinct to wake and guard. Yet exhaustion is powerful, and eventually it wins, pulling minds back into shallow dreams, dreams filled with firelight, with muffled wind, with the slow rhythm of shared breathing. And even as vigilance never fully disappears, rest finds a way to settle in small, fragile pockets. And so the night continues, not in comfort, not in silence, but in a delicate balance of warmth, movement, and attention, where sleep is earned moment by moment, held together by habit and care, and carried forward gently, inch by inch, toward the first faint hint of morning beyond the shuttered walls. Before the first hint of dawn ever touches the snow outside, the cold does something crueler than any windstorm. It settles, becoming heavier, denser, as if the night itself has weight, and inside the cabin the family feels this change without opening their eyes, because winter always tightens its grip just before morning. The fire has grown quiet now, not dead, but cautious, its glow dulled beneath ash, and the warmth it once pushed outward has retreated toward the hearth, leaving the far corners of the room stiff and unforgiving, so the cabin no longer feels evenly cold but uneven, pockets of warmth floating in a sea of chill, forcing sleepers to curl inward, instinctively chasing heat even while dreaming. Someone turns over, straw sighing softly beneath the bedding, a knee brushing against a cold log wall, and pulling back immediately. And this small movement ripples through the shared quilts, because in a frontier cabin no one sleeps alone. Every shift is felt, every adjustment subtly rearranging the fragile balance of warmth. At this hour, sleep becomes strange, shallow, threaded with awareness, dreams mixing with the sensation of cold fingers or a tightening quilt, and children often half-wake without knowing why, their bodies responding before their minds, drawn closer to the center of warmth, where breathing sounds deeper and steadier. The cabin itself seems to speak during these hours, wood contracting with sharp, sudden cracks as temperatures drop, a sound so familiar it barely startles anyone anymore, though to an outsider it might feel alarming. And above it all, the wind scrapes snow against the walls with a slow persistence, like something testing the structure for weakness. Breath thickens the air, moisture gathering invisibly on fabric and hair, and when someone exhales too close to the edge of a quilt, Frost begins to form almost immediately, tiny crystals blooming in the darkness. Proof of how narrow the margin truly is between warmth and ice. In these moments, frontier families relied less on planning and more on instinct, because no one sat up to announce that the night had turned colder. No one measured temperatures or watched clocks. Bodies simply responded, drawing closer, tightening layers, pulling cloth where it was needed most. Actions repeated so often they required no thought. A child burrows deeper beneath an adult's arm. A dog shifts position to block a draft near the floor. A hand reaches out blindly to drag a hanging blanket lower along the bed's edge. And none of it feels dramatic. It feels ordinary, like breathing, because this is how nights always are here. The cold does not attack loudly. It waits, and the families who survived learn to wait with it, matching its patience with their own, not fighting it outright, but refusing to give ground, inch by inch, breath by breath. And somewhere in that quiet resistance, while the fire sleeps lightly beneath its ash and the cabin holds together under snow, the night keeps moving forward, slow and unremarkable, carrying everyone closer to whatever the morning decides to bring. Long before anyone thinks of waking, the cabin enters its coldest hour, that strange stretch of time when the fire has given almost everything it can, and the night has not yet begun to loosen its grip. And it is here, in this quiet, low point, that frontier families learn the most about how little warmth the human body truly needs to survive. The room feels heavier now, not louder, not more violent, but denser, as if the air itself has thickened, and even breathing seems slower, measured, careful, because warmth no longer moves freely. It must be conserved, guarded, kept close like a secret. Under the quilts, bodies are no longer sprawled but folded inward, knees drawn up, shoulders hunched slightly even in sleep, a posture shaped not by comfort but by instinct, because the body knows, even without waking, that surface area is the enemy, that every exposed inch gives the cold another way in. The child stirs and does not cry, because crying wastes heat. So instead there is a soft murmur, half-formed words pressed into fabric, and an adult responds without opening their eyes, an arm shifting, a quilt edge pulled tighter, the exchange silent and practiced, as natural as turning over in bed. Near the floor, the cold is sharpest, and this is where frontier ingenuity shows itself again, with quilts deliberately left long so they drag against the earth, sealing the gap where icy air creeps in, and where dogs often position themselves without being asked, curling into those drafty places as living barriers, fur pressed against wood, warmth offered without instruction. The fire does not flare now. It does not announce itself. It simply exists, a faint internal glow hidden beneath ash, and its presence is felt more than seen, a subtle difference between absolute cold and something just short of it. And in this balance, settlers learned that survival did not require comfort, only steadiness. Sleep here is not deep, not dreamless, but layered, slipping in and out like waves, moments of unconsciousness followed by brief awareness, a shifting, a tightening of blankets, a hand checking a child's face for warmth, then sinking back down again, because full rest is a luxury winter does not grant. Outside, the world is locked and silent. Snow creaked hard under its own weight. Trees frozen mid-grown, animals hidden away conserving energy just as the humans do. And this shared stillness makes the cabin feel less isolated, as if every living thing is enduring the same test at the same hour. No one marks the time. There is no clock, no certainty of how much night remains. Only the knowledge that dawn will come eventually, because it always has before. And that belief, more than heat, carries people through these hours. The cabin holds together not because it is strong, but because nothing is pushing it hard enough to break. And the family inside does the same, not resisting the cold outright, but yielding just enough to let it pass over them without taking anything vital. And so the night continues, quiet, restrained, almost gentle in its cruelty, while breath rises and falls beneath layered quilts. Embers wait patiently beneath ash, and the long winter darkness moves on, minute by minute, without ceremony. The first hint that the night is loosening its hold does not come from light, but from sound, a subtle change in the way the cabin breathes, as if the wood itself has decided to relax after hours of tension, and somewhere beneath the quilts a sleeper becomes aware that the worst has passed, even if the cold has not. The embers in the hearth shift quietly, not flaring, not dying, simply rearranging themselves with a soft collapse that sends a thin thread of warmth outward again, barely noticeable but enough to register on skin that has been holding on all night. And this tiny change travels through the room faster than thought, bodies easing by a fraction, shoulders lowering, breath deepening. A child's foot, stiff with cold, presses against a warmer calf and stays there, no longer pulled away instinctively, and an adult adjusts without waking fully, muscle memory guiding the movement, because by now these gestures belong to the night as much as sleep itself does. Along the walls, frost that formed hours earlier begins to dull, its sharp edges softening as the temperature steadies, and the hanging blankets near the bed whisper faintly as trapped air shifts, releasing the smell of wool and smoke that has built up through the long hours of enclosure. Someone coughs, low and controlled, turning their face into fabric to keep the sound small, and the cabin absorbs it without response, the way it absorbs everything: breath, heat, fatigue, fear, holding it all inside its rough log frame, like a vessel never meant to be full but forced to be. Outside, the wind has changed its tone, no longer scraping angrily, but moving in longer, slower passes, and though no one is awake enough to name it, this change carries meaning, because experienced frontier families learned that when the wind softened, morning was not far behind. Sleep shifts again, not deeper but steadier, less defensive now, dreams smoothing out, losing their sharp edges, and even though bodies remain curled and layered, the urgency eases, replaced by a quiet endurance that feels almost like relief. The dog near the floor stretches, careful not to break the seal of warmth it has helped maintain, then settles again, its presence still purposeful even in rest, and a cat slips silently from one pocket of heat to another, choosing comfort with the same precision humans have learned. No one celebrates this moment, because it happens every night, unnoticed unless it fails to arrive. And yet this subtle turning point, this barely perceptible easing of cold, is the hinge on which survival rests, the moment when the night begins, slowly and reluctantly, to give something back. And inside the cabin, wrapped in layers of habit and shared warmth, the family remains still, letting the night continue its quiet retreat, knowing without words that if they have reached this point, they will likely reach the next, and the next after that, until the world outside loosens enough to allow morning in. Cold does not leave all at once. It thins, retreating unevenly, and the first place it loosens is not near the fire but near the ceiling, where smoke has lingered all night and warmth has quietly collected, and the cabin feels taller somehow, less compressed, as if it has stopped hunching its shoulders against the dark. Someone finally wakes for good, not because of light, but because the body decides it is time, stiffness replacing urgency, and there is a careful moment of stillness before anyone moves, listening to be sure the fire still breathes, that the room has not crossed back into danger while they slept. A quilt edge is peeled back slowly, testing the air like a hand dipped into icy water, and the reaction is instinctive, a sharp inhale, a pause, then acceptance, because mornings are always colder than expected, and this shock has been rehearsed through countless winters. Feet touch the floor briefly and retreat again, then return with resolve, wool socks pulled tight, toes flexing to wake circulation, and the packed earth responds with its familiar bite, not cruel, just honest, reminding everyone that warmth is earned anew each day. At the hearth, ash is brushed aside, revealing coals still alive, red and patient, and the simple relief of that sight settles into the room more deeply than any blanket ever could. because a living fire means water can be warmed, food can be cooked, fingers can thaw, and the night, however long, did not win. Wood is added carefully, not thrown, not rushed, a small log placed just right so it will catch without smothering the embers. And as flame returns, stretching upward with a soft sigh, shadows sharpen on the walls, giving the cabin its shape back. Children begin to stir now, not jumping up, but unfolding slowly, limbs reluctant, faces pressed into fabric to borrow a few more seconds of warmth. And adults allow it, knowing that haste wastes energy, and energy is precious when the cold still owns the morning. Outside, the snow remains hard and unbroken, the sky pale but not yet bright, and the world feels suspended between night and day, a fragile truce where nothing moves quickly, not people, not animals, not even the wind. Inside, the cabin transitions quietly. Bedding is shifted closer to the fire, damp quilts are draped where they might dry, straw is kicked back into place, small repairs already beginning, because survival never pauses, it simply changes tasks. No one speaks much yet. Voices come later, after warmth returns to hands and breath stops aching in the chest. And in this silence you can feel how frontier families did not conquer winter. They negotiated with it daily, night after night, morning after morning, accepting its terms just enough to stay alive. And as the fire strengthens and the cabin slowly wakes, the memory of the night does not vanish. It settles into muscle and habit, shaping how the day will be spent, how much wood must be cut, how carefully the walls must be checked, how the next night will be prepared for long before darkness falls again. Before the cabin fully wakes, there is a brief, almost sacred pause, a stretch of time when the fire has begun to work, but the day has not yet made its demands. And in this quiet interval, frontier families took stock of the night they survived, not with words, but with touch, habit, and small, careful movements. Hands hover near the hearth first, palms turn toward the growing heat, fingers slowly uncurling as feeling returns in waves that sting and ache. And this pain is welcomed, because it means circulation is alive. That numbness has not claimed anything it shouldn't. And adults glance subtly at children's hands and faces, checking color, watching for swelling or whiteness, assessing the night's toll without alarming anyone. Quilts are lifted and shaken gently, frost crystals falling like fine dust onto the floor, proof of how breath condensed and froze in the darkest hours. And these blankets, so vital at night, now feel heavy and damp, needing attention before the next evening arrives. Because nothing on the frontier is ever finished. It is only rotated through cycles of use and repair. Someone opens the door just enough to slide a bucket outside, the crack of cold air slicing in sharply, forcing everyone closer to the fire again, and the door closes quickly. But that brief exchange with the outside reminds the room how hostile the world still is, how thin the boundary remains between warmth and exposure. Children sit near the hearth now, wrapped in quilts like cloaks, watching the flames with quiet fascination, their breath slowing, their bodies thawing. And in these moments lessons are learned without instruction. Lessons about patience, about waiting for warmth instead of rushing into the cold, about how fire must be respected rather than consumed too quickly. Food is simple and slow to come, something warm if possible, water heated carefully, maybe a thin porridge or leftover bread softened near the flame. And eating is less about hunger than about restoring heat from the inside out. A strategy as important as any quilt or wall. Outside chores wait. Wood must be hauled, animals checked, snow cleared where it presses too hard against the walls. But no one rushes yet, because stepping into the morning cold without preparation can undo everything the night was survived for. And frontier families learn to pace themselves, to let the body fully return before asking it for more. As daylight strengthens, shadows retreat, revealing the cabin in full honesty. Soot-stained walls, rough logs, patched fabrics, straw scattered across the floor. And yet within this humble space lies proof of endurance, because everyone inside has crossed another night intact. The memory of cold lingers, not as fear, but as instruction, shaping how the day will unfold, how much wood must be cut, how carefully the fire must be fed, how early preparations for the next night must begin. Because on the frontier, survival is never confined to darkness alone. It stretches across every hour, binding night and day into a single unbroken effort to remain warm enough to live. And as the fire settles into a steady burn and the cabin fills with muted morning light, the story does not close. It simply shifts its weight forward, already leaning toward the next evening, the next test, the next long winter night waiting beyond the edge of the day. By the time the sun finally clears the low horizon, its light does very little to warm the land, yet it changes everything inside the cabin, because daylight brings with it a sense of permission to move, to prepare, to begin again. And frontier families understood that what they did in these early hours would decide how the next night would unfold. The door opens wider now, not just a crack, but enough to let pale light spill across the floor, and with it comes a rush of air so cold it feels solid, carrying the sharp scent of snow and distant wood smoke from other cabins scattered across the landscape. Reminders that this struggle is shared, that other families are waking to the same stiffness, the same calculations. Someone steps outside briefly, boots crunching loud in the frozen quiet, to check the snow piled against the walls, to make sure drifts have not sealed the door completely, and this inspection is done quickly, because even minutes in the open can drain heat earned through the long night, fingers numbing almost immediately despite gloves. Inside, the fire is fed more generously now, flames stretching higher, licking the stones with renewed energy. And this is when damp items are brought close, quilts draped carefully, mittens laid flat, boots turned toward the warmth, but never too close, because experience has taught exactly how far is safe, how easily desperation can turn into loss if something catches fire. Children are given small tasks, not to hurry them into work, but to keep them moving, because movement creates warmth, and a child sent to fetch kindling or straighten bedding stays warmer than one sitting still. And these habits, repeated daily, become second nature, shaping bodies and minds to the rhythms of cold. Breakfast, if it comes, is modest, but warm if at all possible, something to put heat back into the body before the world demands more. And steam rising from a cup or bowl feels almost luxurious, fogging the air, briefly softening the edges of the room. The night's lessons are already being applied. Cracks in the wall noticed in the morning light are marked for more chinking, straw flattened overnight is replaced, snow that insulated too well is trimmed back to prevent dampness later, and every small adjustment is an investment in the next dark stretch ahead. There is no illusion here that the danger has passed. Winter still rules the land, and daylight is only a pause in its advance. But frontier families took these pauses seriously, using them to strengthen routines, repair weaknesses, and prepare both shelter and body for what would come again after sunset. As the cabin fills with the muted sounds of daytime life, footsteps, low voices, the scrape of tools, the memory of the night does not fade. It sharpens, guiding decisions quietly, because survival is cumulative, built from countless small choices made in light and darkness alike. And while the sun climbs slowly, never fully warming the air, the family moves with purpose, knowing that every log split, every quilt dried, every wall sealed, is another small advantage banked against the cold, another reason they might sleep, however lightly, through the next long winter night. As the day stretches on, the cabin slowly empties of its morning stillness. Yet even while chores pull people outward into the cold, the memory of the night never fully releases its grip, because frontier families carried that awareness with them like a second layer of clothing, always thinking ahead to the hours after dark when every decision made now would return with consequences. Axes bite into frozen wood with dull, echoing thuds, each strike sending a shiver up the arms, and the sound travels far across the snow, a reminder that fuel is being secured, that warmth is being stored in advance, because the fire that saves lives at midnight begins as a standing tree cut down in daylight. Breath clouds thicken around faces as logs are split and stacked, hands burning first with cold, then with strain, and this labor is relentless. Not heroic, just necessary, repeated day after day until bodies learn the rhythm and minds stop resisting it, accepting that winter does not negotiate with comfort, only with preparation. Inside the cabin, those who remain tend to quieter work, sewing torn quilts, reinforcing thin spots where stuffing has shifted, patching fabric worn smooth by years of use. And each stitch matters, because a gap in a quilt can feel as dangerous as a gap in a wall once night falls again. Children move between inside and out, cheeks reddened by cold, hands clumsy in mittens, carrying small loads of kindling, shaking snow from boots at the door, learning through repetition where warmth is gained and lost, lessons absorbed without explanation, stored in muscle and memory. The cabin itself changes subtly through the day, firelight replaced by pale sun filtering through shutters, smoke lifting higher as the draft improves, shadows pulling back to reveal every flaw and patch. And these flaws are studied carefully, because daylight shows what darkness hides, and winter exploits whatever is overlooked. Water is fetched and guarded closely, buckets kept near the fire so they will not freeze solid again, and every spill is cleaned quickly, because dampness steals heat faster than wind, and frontier families understood that cold rarely kills directly. It weakens first, softening bodies until something else finishes the work. As afternoon fades, the light outside grows thin and blue, stretching shadows across the snow, and without a word, everyone begins to slow, energy conserved now rather than spent, because exhaustion makes nights longer, colder, more dangerous, and pacing oneself is as important as any tool. The fire is rebuilt carefully, not too large, not too small, embers arranged with the evening in mind, and bedding is shaken once more, laid out where it will be needed. Curtains checked, drafts tested with bare hands, all of it done quietly, methodically, without ceremony. No one announces that night is coming, because it always does. And by the time the sun finally slips away behind the trees, the cabin has already shifted back into its defensive posture, walls sealed, warmth concentrated, bodies drawn inward again. And as darkness settles for another long stretch, the family does not brace themselves with fear, but with routine, stepping back into the familiar pattern of endurance, carrying with them everything learned from the night before, ready once more to meet the cold not with comfort, but with preparation, patience, and the quiet resolve to last until morning comes again. Night returns without ceremony, slipping back over the land the way it always does, and inside the cabin the change is felt before it is seen, a subtle tightening of posture, a quiet narrowing of movement, because frontier families did not greet darkness. They adapted to it automatically. The door closes for the last time, snow brushed from shoulders and boots left near the hearth where they might soften by morning, and the room settles into its smaller shape again, the shape it takes when warmth must be held close and nothing can be wasted. Not space, not energy, not attention. The fire is adjusted with practiced care, logs placed so they will burn slowly rather than brightly, flames lowered deliberately, because a roaring fire feels comforting but dies too fast, while a patient one carries heat through the long middle hours when no one wants to rise. Bedding is arranged differently than it was the night before, small changes made based on what was learned. A thicker quilt pulled to the floor on the colder side of the room, a child shifted inward away from a draft, a hanging cloth lowered a few inches more than yesterday. And no one explains these choices, because explanation is unnecessary when habit already understands. The first moments beneath the quilts are rarely comfortable, bodies still holding the memory of daylight cold, muscles slow to relax, but gradually warmth begins to build again. Breath layering heat into the small enclosed space, and the cabin returns to its muted rhythm of soft sounds, straw whispering, fabric shifting, the low pulse of embers. Outside, the world stiffens once more, trees creaking faintly as temperatures drop, snow hardening under its own weight, and the wind moves in long, cautious sweeps rather than sharp bursts, testing the walls without forcing them. Inside, sleep arrives unevenly, not as surrender but as a slow dimming of awareness. Thoughts trailing off mid-sentence, hands loosening their grip on quilt edges, vigilance easing just enough to allow rest, though never fully disappearing. A child murmurs in their sleep, words indistinct, and an adult responds with a quiet touch, barely waking, the gesture small but precise, restoring stillness without breaking the fragile balance of warmth. Time passes here without markers, measured only by the fire's quiet changes and the body's shifting needs, and the cabin exists in a suspended state. Neither fully awake nor fully asleep, simply holding. The cold presses, then waits, then presses again, and the family responds without drama, without thought, drawing closer, tightening layers, breathing slower, continuing a process refined over countless nights where survival is not an event, but a condition maintained moment by moment. Nothing concludes here, nothing resolves. The night continues, steady and unremarkable, and within its grip the cabin endures, doing exactly what it was built to do. Somewhere in the middle of the night, when even the wind seems to tire of its own noise, the cabin reaches a kind of suspended calm, not warm, not truly safe, but balanced. And this is when frontier sleep, such as it was, became most fragile and most precious. The fire gives a low sound now, not a crackle but a dull settling, and no one moves immediately, because everyone has learned that not every change demands action, that some sounds mean the hearth is still holding on, still doing its quiet work beneath the ash. Breathing in the room synchronizes without intention, deep and slow near the center of the bedding, shallower along the edges where cold lingers, and this unspoken rhythm keeps the cabin steady, a living system adjusting itself minute by minute without words. Thoughts drift in strange directions at this hour, neither dreams nor waking ideas, and people half remember other winters, other nights, moments when the cold bit harder or the fire failed sooner, memories that surface briefly and then fade, leaving only a heightened awareness of the present moment. The walls creak again, a single sharp sound as wood contracts, and a child startles slightly before settling back, reassured by the familiar weight of quilts and the steady presence of others nearby, because fear is easier to manage when it is shared, when it has nowhere to isolate itself. Near the door, frost creeps inward, tracing pale patterns along the bottom log, and someone notices without fully opening their eyes, a hand reaching out to press a folded cloth tighter against the gap, sealing it again by feel alone. The movement so practiced it barely registers as waking. Sleep returns in brief stretches, never deep, never careless, but enough to restore just a little strength. And in those moments the mind grows quiet, surrendering control to habit and body memory, trusting that the systems built around it will hold. Outside, animals remain hidden, conserving energy just as the humans do, the land locked into the same waiting posture, and this shared stillness makes the night feel less hostile, less like an enemy, and more like a test that everyone is enduring together. Nothing dramatic happens in these hours, and that in itself is the victory, because survival here is defined not by events but by their absence, by the quiet continuation of breath, warmth, and awareness, until the darkness thins on its own. The cabin remains in this state, held between cold and warmth, wakefulness and sleep, not moving forward, not falling back, simply existing in a narrow space carved out by preparation and restraint, where life persists without announcement. Before anyone notices light returning, something subtler changes first, a loosening in the body rather than the room, because after hours of holding itself tight against the cold, the human frame begins to trust again, not fully, not foolishly, but enough to stretch fingers inside mittens, or shift a shoulder without bracing for pain. A sleeper exhales more deeply than before, breath no longer caught in the chest, and that single release seems to ripple outward, others following without realizing it, as if the room itself has agreed to let go of a small portion of its vigilance. The fire has not grown brighter, yet it feels closer now, its presence easier to sense through the soles of feet and the backs of hands. And this tells experienced frontier families what no clock ever could, that the deepest cold has likely passed, that the night has spent its sharpest edge. Fabric moves quietly as someone adjusts a quilt, not tugging it tighter this time but smoothing it, redistributing warmth rather than hoarding it. And this difference matters, because it marks the point when survival shifts from defense to maintenance. A child's legs uncurl slightly, knees easing away from the chest, and though the floor is still frozen and the walls still bleed cold, the body no longer reacts as if exposure is imminent, because sensation has returned enough to reassure rather than warn. Even the animals sense this change, a dog lifting its head briefly before settling again in a less guarded posture, a cat choosing a new spot closer to the center of heat rather than the edges it had been patrolling all night. The cabin makes fewer sounds now, wood no longer snapping sharply but resting into itself, snow outside holding firm without shifting. And this quiet feels different from the stillness of danger. It feels earned, the silence that comes when nothing is actively failing. Sleep deepens in uneven pockets, not for everyone at once, but enough that dreams grow softer, less fragmented, images drifting rather than jolting, and for the first time in hours the night feels like something that can be passed through rather than resisted. No one marks this moment or names it, because it happens too often to feel special, yet it is precisely this unnoticed turning that allowed frontier families to endure winter after winter, learning to recognize when to hold tight and when to loosen just enough to recover strength. The cabin remains dim and cold and imperfect, but within it bodies rest more honestly now, trusting that for the moment the balance is holding. And that is enough to let the night continue without further struggle. A faint change begins to spread through the room, not warmth exactly, but a soft return of sensation, the kind that lets you feel your own weight again, the press of straw beneath you, the pull of fabric against your shoulder, reminders that the body has not slipped too far into the cold during the long hours of stillness. Someone shifts deliberately now, not reflexively, rolling onto a different side, testing the air with a cheek instead of recoiling from it, and this small choice signals that the night's grip has weakened enough to allow movement without penalty. The fire responds in its own quiet way, a log settling inward, releasing a brief breath of heat that never flares into flame, but spreads low, and even warming the stones just enough to matter. And this low warmth feels different from earlier heat, calmer, steadier, no longer fighting for dominance. Inside the bedding, limbs stretch a little farther apart, toes unhook from calves, hands loosen their grip on quilt edges, and the tight knots of posture formed for survival slowly unravel into something closer to rest, though never fully relaxed, because winter does not forgive carelessness. The air smells slightly cleaner now, smoke lifting higher as the draft steadies, breath no longer fogging quite as thickly against fabric walls, and the cabin feels less like a sealed vessel and more like a place that can breathe again, even if only shallowly. Thoughts become clearer in this phase of the night. Memories of the previous day surface briefly, the sound of chopping wood, the ache in shoulders, the smell of split pine, then fade again as sleep pulls them back under, because the mind senses it can afford to wander without risk. A child murmurs once, not from discomfort but from a dream, and no one startles, no one reaches out in alarm, because the sound lacks urgency. It belongs to rest rather than warning. Outside, the darkness remains complete, but its weight has shifted, no longer pressing inward with the same insistence, and even without seeing the sky, the body recognizes the slow turning of the world toward morning. The cabin holds this moment quietly, neither advancing nor retreating, suspended in a narrow pocket of tolerance where heat, breath, and time align just enough to let endurance soften into something that almost resembles peace. The quiet that follows is different from earlier silences, less tense, more settled, as if the cabin has accepted the night for what it is, and stopped resisting every small change in temperature, and this acceptance spreads through the sleepers as well, easing the tight vigilance that ruled the darkest hours. A hand slips free of the quilt for a moment, fingers flexing slowly in the air, testing sensation, then resting again without urgency, because the sting that once followed exposure has dulled into something manageable, a reminder rather than a threat. Near the hearth, Ash collapses inward with a soft sigh, revealing a deeper red beneath, and this small pulse of colour reflects faintly on the logs, giving the room shape again, edges returning where darkness had flattened everything into shadow. The packed earth floor no longer feels like an enemy waiting to steal warmth, just cold and solid, predictable, and this predictability matters, because danger on the frontier was often worst when it surprised you, not when it announced itself plainly. Sleep shifts again, this time carrying weight, drawing bodies downward instead of holding them coiled near the surface. And though rest remains light, it is more generous now, offering longer stretches where thoughts dissolve completely, rather than snapping back at the slightest change. Someone exhales a long breath. They did not know they were holding, chest lowering slowly, and this release seems to ripple outward, the shared space responding as if relieved, because tension here was never individual. It belonged to the room as much as to any person. The smell of smoke softens, less sharp now, blending with woolen earth into something almost comforting, familiar enough that the mind stops cataloguing it and lets it fade into the background of awareness. Even the cold behaves differently, no longer probing, no longer creeping, simply present, settled into the walls and floor where it can be anticipated and accounted for, and this steadiness allows the body to rest without constantly preparing to react. Time becomes harder to measure here, thoughts stretching and thinning, moments blurring together without urgency, because nothing needs immediate attention, and that absence of demand feels rare, valuable. The cabin remains imperfect, the night still long, but within this narrow window of balance, endurance relaxes its grip just enough to allow rest to deepen, not because the cold has retreated, but because it has been understood, contained, and temporarily held in place. A different kind of stillness settles in now, one that does not come from effort but from familiarity, because after enough nights like this, the body stops arguing with the cold, and instead learns its patterns, recognizing when danger is near and when it has eased just enough to allow rest. Muscles loosen by degrees rather than all at once, shoulders dropping a fraction, jaws unclenching, breath lengthening without being forced, and this gradual release feels earned, the result of hours spent holding warmth in, conserving energy, waiting patiently for the night to lose its sharpest edge. Thoughts drift sideways rather than forward, no longer circling fear or discomfort, but slipping into fragments of memory, a sound of chopping wood earlier that day, the smell of smoke caught in clothing, the dull ache in hands that promised work again soon, images that pass without demanding attention. A sleeper turns onto their back, testing the air above the quilt, feeling the contrast between cool skin and retained warmth beneath, and finding it tolerable now, not pleasant, but no longer alarming, which is all that is needed at this hour. Nearby, fabric settles softly as weight redistributes, the quilt no longer clutched tight but resting where it falls, and this small shift marks a change in purpose, from holding heat at all costs to allowing it to circulate where it is most needed. Outside sounds fade almost completely, not because the world has gone silent, but because attention no longer seeks them out, ears no longer straining for threat, trusting instead the quiet signals inside, the steady rhythm of breathing, the low presence of heat that has not failed. Sleep deepens unevenly, arriving in slow waves rather than sudden collapse, carrying the mind just far enough away to rest without fully disconnecting, a state learned through repetition rather than comfort. Nothing announces this phase of the night. No marker separates it from what came before, yet it is here that endurance turns gentler, where vigilance loosens without disappearing, allowing strength to return without risk. A subtle awareness begins to return before anyone truly wakes, not a thought but a sense, the feeling that the body can afford to exist again rather than merely endure. And this shift is so slight, it would be missed entirely if it hadn't been learned over countless winters. Fingers uncurl slowly inside sleeves, joints testing their range without urgency, and when no sharp pain answers back, the mind drifts instead of snapping to attention, allowing rest to stretch a little longer, to settle more honestly into the bones. Breath grows fuller now, no longer rationed, and with it comes a faint warmth rising from the chest outward, not enough to banish the cold, but enough to remind the body that it is still working as it should, that circulation has held through the worst hours. Somewhere nearby, fabric shifts as weight redistributes, not in defense, not in search of heat, but simply because comfort, however modest, has become possible again, and that change alters everything about how the remaining night is experienced. Dreams, when they come, are quieter now, less jagged, less interrupted, images drifting past without urgency, snowfields without wind, firelight without smoke, memories softened by distance, and even when a sleeper stirs, it is without alarm, without the sharp edge of fear that ruled earlier. The air no longer feels as hostile against exposed skin, still cold, still present, but predictable, and predictability is its own form of safety, allowing the body to stop bracing and start recovering. Movement slows across the room, not because anyone is fully asleep, but because there is no longer a need to adjust constantly, no drafts demanding correction, no sudden losses of warmth that require immediate response. Time stretches here, elastic and indistinct, neither dragging nor racing, and within this stretched moment, endurance transforms quietly into something steadier, less strained, built not from resistance but from familiarity. Nothing dramatic marks this phase. No sound, no signal, no event, only the gradual easing of effort, the sense that the night has taken what it can and is no longer pressing for more. The darkness thins almost imperceptibly, not at the edges of the room but inside the mind, where attention loosens its grip and the instinct to monitor every sensation finally eases, allowing the body to exist without constant correction. A leg stretches a little farther than before, toes no longer tuck tightly for protection, and the air touching skin feels cool but tolerable, a condition that would have been impossible hours earlier. And this quiet comparison is made without words, registered only as relief. Breathing settles into a slower rhythm, deeper now, filling spaces that were held tight through the coldest stretch, and with each inhale warmth spreads just enough to soften stiff joints and dull the ache that clung to them through the night. Someone shifts position deliberately, rolling onto a side that was avoided earlier, trusting that the surface beneath will not steal heat too quickly now. And when nothing sharp follows, the movement is allowed to remain, the body choosing ease over defense. The smell in the air changes subtly as well, less smoke, more fabric and earth, a blend that signals stability rather than threat, and the senses stop cataloguing it, freeing the mind to drift without interruption. Sleep deepens in fragments, not heavy, not careless, but restorative in its own restrained way, offering just enough distance from awareness to let muscles recover and thoughts quiet. There is no sense of victory here, no relief dramatic enough to notice consciously, only the understanding, learned and trusted, that this portion of the night is kinder, that the balance has shifted in favor of rest. Moments stretch without urgency, stitched together by breathing and stillness. And in this stretch the body gathers what strength it can, storing it quietly for the hours ahead. A faint readiness settles in, not the readiness to rise, but the sense that the body could if it had to, and this knowledge changes how the remaining hours are felt, because danger no longer feels immediate, only persistent, something that can be managed rather than fought. The weight of the quilts shifts from burden to shelter, pressing evenly now instead of being clutched, and skin remembers warmth long enough to stop flinching, long enough to let stillness do its work. Somewhere close, a sleeper adjusts their jaw, releasing tension held since evening, teeth no longer clenched against the cold, and that small relaxation spreads outward, a chain reaction of easing muscles and slowing breath. Sound thins further, not into silence but into a background hum so steady it fades from notice. The quiet presence of embers, the faint settling of fabric, the distant world held at bay without needing to be monitored. Thoughts slow into simple impressions rather than stories. Light without images, memory without detail, and this simplicity allows rest to gather depth without fully pulling the mind under. The body takes advantage of this window, repairing what the cold taxed earlier, sending warmth back into hands and feet, not quickly, not generously, but reliably enough to matter. Time loses its edges here, minutes blending into one another without urgency, and within that blur endurance becomes routine rather than effort, a state learned through repetition rather than strength. Nothing announces what comes next, and nothing needs to, because this is not a turning point so much as a continuation, a quieter stretch where survival holds steady without demanding attention. The hours keep moving, carried by breath and habit, and those resting within this space remain suspended between night and morning, neither bracing nor celebrating, simply existing in a balance that has been reached and, for now, maintained. The sense of effort fades further now, replaced by a muted steadiness that settles into the body like a memory being replayed, rather than a task being performed, because by this point the cold has revealed everything it intends to do, and nothing new is waiting in ambush. Skin remembers warmth long enough to trust it, circulation moving without constant encouragement, and even the places that ache do so dully, no longer sharp enough to command attention, which allows awareness to drift without snapping back at every sensation. The sleeper shifts again, not to seek heat, but simply to change position, the way one might on a mild night, and this movement feels almost indulgent, a small luxury earned through hours of restraint and patience. Breathing becomes the dominant rhythm, slow and even, filling the dark with something steady and alive, and this rhythm carries thought with it, smoothing rough edges, flattening worries into background impressions that no longer demand response. The cold remains, unchanged in truth, but it has lost its authority, reduced to a condition rather than a threat, something acknowledged rather than resisted, and this shift allows the body to stop measuring itself against it. Rest deepens in short spans, not long enough to forget, but long enough to restore, and in these spans the mind empties, leaving only the sensation of weight, fabric, breath, and stillness. Nothing needs adjusting now. Nothing calls for intervention, and this absence of demand is what defines this stretch of night. Not comfort, but stability, the quiet assurance that everything required to endure has already been set in place. Time continues forward without markers, neither hurried nor stalled, and within it endurance becomes passive, carried by habit rather than effort, the body conserving strength without conscious direction. The remaining darkness passes in this subdued state, neither tense nor relaxed, simply held, allowing those resting to remain intact, preserved just well enough for the morning that will eventually insist on movement again. Eventually, without announcement, the night gives way, not in a sudden release, but in a gradual thinning, and what remains is not warmth, but survivability, the simple fact that breath still moves easily, fingers still respond, and no part of the body has gone silent in the dark. The fire is coaxed back into fuller life one last time, flames rising with a familiar sound that signals continuation rather than triumph, and faces turn toward it instinctively, letting heat return at its own pace, because rushing warmth after cold is never wise, and frontier families learned patience even here. Quilts are loosened, not thrown aside, just eased enough to allow movement, and limbs unfold slowly, stiff but responsive, carrying the memory of the night in every joint, a reminder of what was endured rather than a mark of defeat. Children wake in stages, blinking, quiet, pressed close, a moment longer before sitting up, their world narrowing first to firelight and fabric before expanding again to walls, tools, and the pale promise of day beyond the shutters. Outside, the cold still holds the land firmly, snow unbroken, air sharp, but the worst hour has passed, and that knowledge settles deeper than any heat, shaping how the day will be approached, carefully, deliberately, with no wasted effort. Nothing about this morning feels victorious, and it is not meant to, because survival on the frontier was never celebrated loudly. It was acknowledged through routine, through the simple continuation of tasks, through the fact that there are tasks at all to perform. Water is warmed, hands are rubbed, boots are pulled on slowly, and the night recedes into muscle memory, into habit, into the unspoken understanding that it will return again, and preparations must begin immediately, quietly, without complaint. This is how frontier families slept through the coldest nights, not by conquering winter, not by escaping it, but by learning its limits, adapting to its rhythms, and meeting it with just enough warmth, just enough vigilance, and just enough endurance to greet another morning still whole.